My wife let her family visit our newborn every day for 3 weeks. Mine couldn't even see a photo. Then her own sister pulled me aside and showed me the text messages. Our daughter was born 3 weeks ago, and my wife Jessica has refused to let any of my family meet her. Not my parents, who live 20 minutes away. Not my sister, who flew in from across the country. Not even my grandmother, who's 92 and might not have many chances left. Jessica's family has been over every single day. Her mother practically lives in our nursery. Her father has taken 500 photos. Her siblings come and go like they own the place. But when my mother calls asking when she can meet her first grandchild, Jessica starts crying about boundaries and safety and needing space. The excuses keep changing. First, it was because of germs and the baby's immune system, but her family members were coming straight from their jobs at a daycare, a hospital, and a gym. Then, it was about overwhelming the baby, but her family threw a party in our living room when the baby was 5 days old with 15 people. Then it was about establishing routines, but her mother rearranges our entire schedule whenever she visits. My mother offered to wear a mask, wash her hands, stay outside, and look through the window, anything just to see the baby once. Jessica said that was creepy and obsessive. When my mom sent a gift, Jessica returned it, saying we didn't have room for more stuff, while her mother had filled the nursery with things we didn't need or want. I tried talking to Jessica about fairness, and she said life wasn't fair, and I needed to respect her as a mother. She said she'd gone through labor, so she got to make the rules about who saw the baby. When I pointed out I was the father, she said I didn't understand the bond between a mother and child, and I was being controlling. Her mother backed her up, saying new mothers needed support, not arguments, looking at me like I was some kind of abuser for wanting my family to meet my daughter. My sister had planned her entire visit around meeting the baby. She'd taken time off work, bought a plane ticket, booked a hotel to not impose on us. Jessica knew this for months. When my sister arrived, Jessica suddenly developed anxiety about visitors and said she couldn't handle anyone outside her immediate support system, which apparently only included her blood relatives. My sister sat in her hotel room for 4 days, waiting for permission to meet her niece before flying home. Heartbroken, Jessica posted on social media about how hard motherhood was. While her friends commented that she was doing amazing, my father-in-law posted photos holding the baby with captions about being the world's proudest grandpa. When my dad commented asking when he could meet her, Jessica deleted his comment and blocked him. She told me he was being aggressive and boundary crossing on her posts. The breaking point came when my grandmother called from the hospital. She'd had a fall and was being admitted for surgery. She asked if she could see a photo of the baby before her operation just in case. Jessica heard me on the phone and started screaming that I was emotionally manipulating her by using my grandmother's health. She grabbed my phone and told my grandmother that she was toxic for guilt-tripping a new mother and hung up. My grandmother was so confused, she thought she'd done something terrible. That's when Jessica's sister, Amy, pulled me aside. She'd been watching everything unfold and couldn't stay quiet anymore. She told me the real reason Jessica was keeping my family away. Before we got married, Jessica had been engaged to someone else named Christopher. His mother had been very involved in wedding planning, and Jessica had hated it. When they broke up, Jessica swore she'd never let another mother-in-law near any future children she had. She'd been planning this since she got pregnant, telling her family she was going to establish dominance early and make sure my mother knew her place, which was nowhere near the baby. Amy said Jessica had a whole strategy about making my family beg and gravel, then still saying no to break their spirits. She wanted them to give up trying so she'd never have to deal with them. Amy showed me text messages where Jessica bragged about making my sister waste money on a trip for nothing, saying it would teach her not to assume she had the right to the baby. Amy also showed me Jessica's group chat with her friends, where she was laughing about my grandmother in the hospital, calling her dramatic and saying old people always used health scares for attention. She'd written that she hoped my grandmother would pass before the baby was old enough to remember, so she wouldn't have to deal with visits. I confronted Jessica with the messages, and she tried to grab Amy's phone to delete them. Amy had already sent them to me. Jessica screamed that Amy was jealous and a traitor to their sisterhood. She said I was choosing my family over her and the baby. I said I was choosing not to let her abuse my family anymore. I took the baby to meet my parents that day. Jessica called the police saying I'd kidnapped our daughter. The officers asked if I was the father. I said yes. They said I had equal rights to take the baby places and left. Jessica's mother showed up at my parents' house demanding I return the baby immediately. She stood on the porch screaming my name, demanding I hand over her granddaughter immediately. My father held his phone steady, recording every word while my mother stayed inside with the baby pressed against her shoulder. I stood behind the screen door and explained as calmly as I could that I was the father and had every right to bring my daughter here. Jessica's mother's face turned red as she yelled that I was a kidnapper, that I'd stolen the baby, that Jessica was at home having a panic attack because of what I'd done. My father kept filming, not saying a word, just documenting everything. She threatened to call her lawyer right then and there, said she'd make sure I never saw my daughter again, that Jessica would get full custody, and I'd be lucky to get supervised visits once a month. My father zoomed in on her face as she made the threat, getting every word clearly on video. After 20 minutes of screaming, she finally got back in her car and peeled out of the driveway, nearly hitting the mailbox on her way out. My parents and I I stood there in silence for a moment before my mother asked if I was okay. I wasn't sure how to answer that question. I drove home 3 hours later, knowing I needed to sit down with Jessica and have a real conversation about our marriage, about what was happening, about whether we could fix this. When I pulled into our driveway, every light in the house was on, and I could see shadows moving past the windows. I walked through the front door and found Jessica's entire family in our living room. Her father stood up first and started yelling before I even closed the door behind me. He called me a kidnapper, said I'd traumatized his daughter, demanded to know what kind of man takes a baby away from her mother without permission. Jessica's mother joined in, saying I was trying to steal the baby, that I was dangerous, that they should call the police again. Her brother accused me of being controlling. Her sister said I was abusive, and they all talked over each other, creating this wall of noise and anger. Jessica sat in the middle of the couch holding our daughter, tears running down her face, looking at me like I was a stranger who'd broken into her home. I tried to speak, but her father cut me off, stepping closer and pointing his finger at my chest. Her mother pulled out her phone and started recording me, saying she wanted evidence of my aggressive behavior. I stood there with my hands at my sides, not moving, not yelling back, just letting them attack me while Jessica cried and played the victim. That's when I understood what was happening. She'd already told them her version of events, already painted me as the villain, already made herself into the innocent mother protecting her baby from her unstable husband. Nothing I said would matter because she'd gotten to them first. I asked if we could talk privately, and Jessica shook her head, saying anything I had to say could be said in front of her family. Her mother agreed, saying Jessica needed their support and protection. I looked at my wife holding our daughter and saw a stranger looking back at me. Her family didn't leave until after midnight, each of them making sure to tell me on their way out that they were watching me, that they'd protect Jessica and the baby no matter what. When the last car pulled away, Jessica and I sat in cold silence in our living room, with the baby sleeping between us in her bassinet. She looked at me and said I had a choice to make. I could apologize to her entire family for what I'd done, admit I was wrong to take the baby without her permission, and promise to never let my family near our daughter without her explicit approval, or I could refuse, and she'd make sure I regretted it for the rest of my life. I told her I wasn't apologizing for letting my parents meet their granddaughter. She picked up the bassinet and walked to our bedroom, locking the door behind her and leaving me standing alone in the living room. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the baby cry through the walls, while Jessica refused to let me in to help. The next morning, Jessica's family started their attack through every channel they had. My phone started buzzing before 7 with text messages from her mother, her siblings, her father, all of them telling me I needed to apologize and fix what I'd broken. Jessica's mother posted on social media about protecting babies from dangerous people, keeping the post vague enough that anyone reading it would fill in their own worst fears. Her friends commented immediately with support, asking if she was okay, offering to help however they could. Her father shared articles about parental rights and custody battles, each one with a pointed caption about fathers who try to control their families. By noon, my own relatives were calling me, having seen the posts, asking if everything was okay and what was really going on. I tried explaining, but it sounded crazy even to my own ears. My wife won't let my family meet the baby, but her family visits every day. She called the police when I took our daughter to meet my parents. Now her whole family is attacking me online and through texts. It sounded like I was the problem, like I was the one being unreasonable. Jessica refused to speak to me directly, sending all communication through her mother, who called every few hours with new ultimatums and demands. By the end of the second day, I had over 100 messages across texts, emails, and social media, all painting me as an unstable father who'd kidnapped his own child. Amy showed up at my workplace during my lunch break, looking over her shoulder as she walked through the parking lot like she was followed. She had her laptop under her arm and asked if we could talk somewhere private. We sat in my car and she opened a private online group chat that made my stomach turn.
Jessica had been documenting her strategy since month 6 of her pregnancy, complete with advice from other women about how to legally exclude in-laws and establish sole control over baby access. The messages went back months, showing Jessica researching parental rights laws in our state, asking questions about how to build a case for me being unstable, celebrating each time she successfully kept my family away during doctor appointments and hospital visits.
One woman told Jessica to start documenting everything I did wrong, even small things, to build a pattern of concerning behavior. Another suggested Jessica talk to a lawyer before the baby was born to understand her rights. Jessica had responded to that one, saying she'd already consulted with someone and knew exactly what she needed to do. Amy scrolled through message after message, showing Jessica's calculated plan to control access to our daughter. I took a personal day from work and drove to meet with Samir Carlson, the family law attorney my sister had found through her research into parental rights. His office was in a building downtown, the kind of place that felt too expensive for me, but I didn't have a choice anymore. Samir reviewed everything I brought, spreading Amy's screenshots across his desk next to the text messages, the police report from Jessica's false kidnapping claim, and the video my father had taken of Jessica's mother threatening me. He explained that I had equal parental rights regardless of who gave birth, that Jessica could not legally prevent me from taking our daughter places, and that her pattern of behavior could actually work against her in any custody dispute. He asked if I wanted to try to save the marriage, or if I was ready to file for separation and custody. I told him I didn't know yet. I just needed to understand my rights and protect my family's ability to see their granddaughter. Samir said he'd draft a letter to Jessica outlining my parental rights and her legal obligations, and that if she continued to interfere, we could file for a formal custody arrangement. Jessica somehow found out I'd met with an attorney within hours of me leaving Samir's office. I suspect her mother had been following me or checking my credit card statements, because there was no other way she could have known that fast. When I got home that evening, I found the locks changed on our bedroom and the nursery. A note was taped to the bedroom door telling me I could sleep in the guest room until I came to my senses. I tried the door handle and found it locked, tried calling Jessica's phone and got sent straight to voicemail. Her mother answered on the second ring when I called her, saying she'd moved into our house to support Jessica during this difficult time. She told me Jessica and the baby were sleeping in the nursery, and I wasn't welcome in either room until I apologized and agreed to Jessica's terms. I asked where I was supposed to sleep, and she said the guest room was perfectly comfortable, that maybe some time alone would help me think about what I'd done. When I checked our bank accounts that night, I found Jessica had changed all the passwords and moved most of our money into accounts with only her name. My mother reached out to a professional mediator she'd found through our church, hoping we could resolve this before it became a full legal battle. Surprisingly, Jessica agreed to meet as long as her mother could attend. The mediation session happened at a neutral office in a building near the courthouse. We sat around a conference table, me and my parents on one side, Jessica and her mother on the other, with the mediator at the head trying to facilitate conversation. Within 15 minutes, it became clear this was a disaster. Jessica's mother dominated the conversation, interrupting the mediator, speaking for Jessica, rejecting every suggestion before Jessica could even respond. The mediator had to ask her repeatedly to let Jessica speak for herself, but Jessica just cried and repeated that I'd betrayed her trust. My parents offered compromises, saying they'd accept supervised visits, short meetings, whatever Jessica needed to feel comfortable. Jessica's mother rejected everything, saying my family couldn't be trusted, that they'd already proven they didn't respect Jessica's boundaries by encouraging me to take the baby without permission. Jessica nodded along with everything her mother said, never contradicting her, never offering her own thoughts. The mediator finally suggested we take a break, and when we came back, Jessica and her mother announced they were leaving because this was clearly a waste of time. 2 days after the failed mediation, someone walked into my office at work carrying a manila envelope with my name on it. I got served with legal papers right there in front of my coworkers. Jessica had filed for an emergency custody order claiming I'd kidnapped our daughter, exhibited unstable and threatening behavior, and that she feared for the baby's safety in my care. The petition included statements from her mother and 2 of her friends describing me as controlling and aggressive, painting a picture of me that wasn't true, but sounded terrible on paper. I forwarded the documents to Samir immediately, and he called me within minutes, his voice tight with urgency. He told me we needed to respond quickly, that the emergency hearing was scheduled in just 5 days, and that we needed to gather all our evidence and prepare for court. The emergency custody hearing took place in a small courtroom with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs. Jessica's lawyer presented her as a frightened new mother, protecting her infant from an unstable father, using her statements and her mother's testimony to build a narrative of me as dangerous and unpredictable. Then Samir stood up and presented the text messages Amy had provided, showing Jessica's premeditated plan to exclude my family. The judge put on her reading glasses and went through Jessica's own words about breaking their spirits and making them beg and gravel. She looked up at Jessica with clear disapproval and asked Jessica's lawyer if she was aware her client had documented her intentions to manipulate custody access. Jessica's face went white as the judge continued reading through the messages. The judge read out loud the message where Jessica laughed about my grandmother being in the hospital, calling her dramatic, saying, "Old people always used health scares for attention." Then she read the part where Jessica wrote that she hoped my grandmother would pass before the baby was old enough to remember her, so she wouldn't have to deal with visits. The courtroom went silent. Jessica's lawyer tried to interrupt the judge, saying the messages were private conversations, not meant for legal proceedings, but the judge held up her hand and kept reading. She went through message after message where Jessica described her plans to break my family's spirit, to make them beg, to establish dominance from day one. When she finished reading, she took off her glasses and looked directly at Jessica with an expression that made even Jessica's mother stop talking. The judge denied the emergency custody request completely and said there was no evidence I posed any danger to our daughter. Then she ordered a temporary custody arrangement where we'd each have the baby for 3 days at a time until a full hearing could happen. Jessica started crying immediately, loud sobs that echoed through the small courtroom. But the judge wasn't done. She mandated that we both had to attend family counseling twice a week with a therapist she'd assign, and she warned Jessica very clearly that the documented statements about deliberately excluding my family could be considered parental alienation if this pattern continued. Jessica's mother stood up and started arguing with the judge, saying new mothers needed protection and support, not punishment. And didn't the court understand how vulnerable Jessica was after giving birth? The judge told her to sit down, or she'd be removed from the courtroom. Jessica's lawyer pulled her mother back into her seat while Jessica kept crying, and I could see Samir next to me writing notes about everything that was happening. The judge set a date for the full custody hearing 6 weeks away and told us both we needed to follow the 3-day schedule exactly. No exceptions, no flexibility without court approval. We left through different exits, and I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes just processing what had happened. 3 days later, I drove to an office building downtown for our first mandated counseling session with Wilhelmina Gentry. The waiting room had uncomfortable chairs and old magazines, and Jessica was already there with her mother sitting beside her holding her hand. Wilhelmina called us back to her office, a small room with 2 couches facing each other and a chair where she sat with a notepad. Jessica's mother tried to follow us in, but Wilhelmina stopped her at the door, saying this was for parents only. The session started with Wilhelmina asking us each to describe what brought us here, and Jessica immediately launched into crying and talking about how hard labor was, how overwhelmed she felt, how nobody understood what new mothers went through. She talked for probably 20 minutes about her birth experience, about sleepless nights, about how scary it was to be responsible for a tiny human. Wilhelmina listened patiently, nodding occasionally, writing notes. Then she asked Jessica directly about the text messages describing her plan to exclude my family, and Jessica's whole demeanor changed. She stopped crying and said those messages were taken out of context, that she was just venting to friends the way all new mothers do, that everyone says things they don't mean when they're stressed. Wilhelmina asked what context would make hoping someone's grandmother dies acceptable, and Jessica's face went red. She said Wilhelmina was biased against mothers, that therapists were supposed to be supportive, that she was twisting Jessica's words to make her look bad. Wilhelmina stayed calm and said she was simply reading what Jessica had written in her own words. Jessica crossed her arms and refused to talk for the rest of the hour, and Wilhelmina documented that in her notes. My phone rang while I was at work 2 days later, and Amy's name flashed on the screen. She was talking fast, her voice shaking, saying, "I needed to know what just happened." Jessica's mother had shown up at Amy's apartment that morning with $2,000 in cash spread out on Amy's kitchen table. She'd begged Amy to tell the court she made up the text messages, or that I'd somehow manipulated her into providing them, or that she'd misunderstood what Jessica meant. Amy had started recording on her phone the moment she realized what was happening, and she'd captured everything. Her mother's voice on the recording was desperate, offering the money, then threatening to cut Amy off financially if she didn't help Jessica. She said the whole family would turn against Amy, that she'd be blamed for destroying Jessica's life, that she'd never be welcome at family events again. Amy told her mother no, that she wasn't going to lie in court, and her mother had left the cash on the table and walked out. Amy forwarded me the recording file while we were still on the phone, and I could hear her crying as she said she was done protecting Jessica from the consequences of her own actions. She said losing her relationship with their mother was worth it if it meant doing the right thing, but her voice broke when she said it. The first day of my 3-day custody period under the court order felt like Christmas morning when I was a kid. I picked up our daughter from Jessica's mother's house where they'd been staying, and Jessica handed her over without looking at me. I drove straight to my grandmother's house where she was recovering at home from her surgery. My whole family was already there waiting, and when I walked in carrying the baby, my grandmother started crying. She held her great-granddaughter for the first time, touching her tiny fingers, looking at her face like she was memorizing every detail. My mother took photos of 4 generations together. My grandmother in her recliner holding the baby, my mother standing behind her, me beside them. My sister finally got to hold her niece sitting on the couch and just staring at her for long minutes without saying anything. My father sat quietly in his chair with the baby sleeping on his chest, and I watched his face relax in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. Nobody tried to do too much or overwhelm the baby. We just sat together in my grandmother's living room, passing her around gently, letting everyone have their turn. My mother made lunch and we ate while the baby slept, and for a few hours, everything felt normal and right. My grandmother told me before I left that she'd been praying for this moment, that she hadn't been sure she'd live to see it, and I had to turn away so she wouldn't see me crying. The 3 days with my family passed too quickly, and Sunday evening came when I was supposed to return the baby to Jessica. I drove to our house at the agreed time, 6 wow, but Jessica's car wasn't in the driveway. I called her phone and it went straight to voicemail. I texted her asking where she was and got no response. I sat in my car with the baby in her car seat behind me, waiting, checking my phone every few minutes. 7 no passed, then 8 ohs. Finally, at 8:15, Jessica's mother texted me saying Jessica wasn't ready to take the baby back yet, and I needed to be more flexible about the schedule. I took screenshots of everything with timestamps, the unanswered calls, the texts, the time showing on my phone. Then I called Samir and he answered on the second ring. He told me to contact the police non-emergency line to report a custody order violation, that I needed to document this officially. I made the call while sitting sitting in my driveway, and the dispatcher said they'd send officers to Jessica's location. 2 police officers showed up at our house about 30 minutes later. I'd driven there and was waiting outside when they arrived, and they knocked on the door while I stood on the sidewalk holding the baby. Jessica's mother answered and immediately started talking about how mothers have more rights than fathers, how the schedule was too rigid, how Jessica needed more time. One of the officers was a woman, and she cut Jessica's mother off mid-sentence. She explained very clearly that the custody order was a court mandate, not a suggestion, and Jessica needed to comply immediately. Jessica's mother argued that the court didn't understand what new mothers needed, and the officer told her that continuing to violate the order could result in contempt of court charges. Jessica finally came to the door, her eyes red from crying, and the officer asked if she was refusing to take custody of her child at the court-ordered time. Jessica reached for the baby, and I handed her over, and Jessica started crying dramatically while holding her. The officers documented everything in their report, writing down the time, the delay, Jessica's mother's statements. They told us both that the next exchange needed to happen on time or there would be legal consequences, and they left. Our next counseling session happened 3 days later, and Wilhelmina started by saying she'd reviewed her notes from our first session and had some recommendations. She looked at Jessica and said she was recommending individual therapy to address what she'd identified as control issues stemming from past relationship trauma. Jessica's face went pale, and she started to interrupt, but Wilhelmina kept talking. She said she'd noted concerning patterns in how Jessica used the baby as a weapon against my family, and that while her feelings about her ex's mother were valid, she was now punishing people who had nothing to do with that situation. She explained that Jessica was using our daughter to settle old emotional scores from a completely different relationship, and that wasn't healthy for anyone involved. Jessica stood up and said Wilhelmina didn't understand anything, that she was supposed to be helping but was just making things worse. Wilhelmina stayed calm and said she was trying to help Jessica see the patterns in her behavior before they damaged her relationship with her daughter permanently. Jessica grabbed her purse and walked out of the session halfway through, leaving me sitting there alone with Wilhelmina. Wilhelmina wrote something in her notes and said she'd be documenting this in her report to the court. Over the next 2 weeks, I started noticing cracks in Jessica's family support system. Amy had completely sided with me and moved out of her parents' house into an apartment with a roommate. Then Chase, Jessica's younger brother, started texting me privately, saying he thought his sister had gone too far. He said he'd tried talking to Jessica about compromise, and she'd screamed at him that he was betraying her, that everyone was against her, that she was the victim in all this. Chase told me their father was getting tired of the drama and just wanted Jessica to work out a reasonable custody arrangement so the family could move on. Jessica's mother was becoming increasingly isolated in her support of Jessica's extreme position. Even some of Jessica's friends had stopped commenting on her social media posts, and the ones who did comment were suggesting she consider therapy or mediation. Chase sent me screenshots of the family group chat where their father had written that Jessica needed to accept reality and stop fighting a battle she'd already lost. Jessica had responded by leaving the group chat entirely. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica asking if we could meet alone. No lawyers, no family. We agreed to meet in a parking lot near our house, neutral territory where neither of us would feel ambushed. I got there first and sat in my car waiting, and when she pulled up beside me, she looked exhausted. We both got out and sat in her car because it was raining, and for a few minutes neither of us said anything. Then Jessica started talking, her voice quiet and shaky. She said she'd been scared since she got pregnant that she'd lose control like she did with Christopher's mother, that seeing my family's excitement had triggered all those old feelings of being overwhelmed and powerless. She admitted that Christopher's mother had taken over everything, the wedding planning, their lives, and it had been suffocating. When they broke up, she'd promised herself she'd never let that happen again, but she realized now she'd gone too far in the other direction. I told her I understood being hurt by past experiences, that I got why she was scared, but our daughter deserved to know both families. I said I couldn't stay married to someone who would use our child as a weapon to hurt people I loved, that I couldn't watch her punish my family for things Christopher's mother had done. We both cried sitting there in her car while rain hit the windshield. Jessica said she didn't know if she could change enough to make this marriage work, and I said I didn't know either. 6 weeks after the emergency hearing, we were back in court for the full custody hearing. This time, both sides had complete cases prepared with evidence, witness statements, and professional recommendations. Jessica's lawyer presented her side first, focusing on bonding and breastfeeding and maternal instinct. Then Samir presented our evidence, including the new recording of Jessica's mother trying to bribe Amy, the police report from the custody violation, and Wilhelmina's detailed notes about Jessica walking out of therapy. Wilhelmina's written report recommended equal custody, with structured exchanges noted Jessica's progress in beginning to acknowledge her control issues, but also documented her continued resistance to allowing my family unsupervised access to the baby. The judge read through everything carefully, taking her time, asking questions about specific incidents and timeline details. Then she established a permanent custody arrangement where we'd each have the baby for alternating weeks with both families allowed to visit during our respective custody times without requiring the other parent's permission. Jessica started crying again, but didn't argue, and her lawyer said they'd comply with the order. I started going to my individual therapy sessions every Tuesday evening, and Jessica went to hers on Thursday afternoons with a different therapist the court had approved. Wilhelmina kept working with both of us separately, checking in on how we were handling the custody arrangement and whether we were making progress on the issues that had brought us to court. About 6 weeks into the new schedule, Wilhelmina called me after one of her sessions with Jessica and asked if we could meet for coffee to talk about something off the record. We sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop near her office, and she told me that Jessica was finally doing real work on her trauma from Christopher instead of just blaming everyone else for her problems. She said Jessica had spent weeks deflecting and making excuses, but something had shifted recently, and she was starting to acknowledge how she'd recreated the exact control dynamic she'd hated, just with herself holding all the power this time. Valina couldn't share specific details because of confidentiality, but she wanted me to know that Jessica was making genuine progress and might actually be capable of being a good co-parent eventually. I thanked her for telling me, even though it didn't change the fact that our marriage was probably over. 3 days later, Jessica called me during her custody week around 8 WAS in the evening. I almost didn't answer because we usually only texted about pickup times and baby supplies, but something made me pick up. Her voice sounded different, quieter, and less defensive than I'd heard in months. She apologized for everything, really apologized, without making excuses or blaming other people, and said her therapist was helping her see how she'd used our daughter as a weapon to hurt my family because she was scared of losing control again. She told me about Christopher's mother taking over their wedding planning, choosing everything from flowers to the menu to the guest list without asking what Jessica wanted. She said it had felt like drowning, like she was just a prop in someone else's event, and when the engagement ended, she'd promised herself she'd never feel that powerless again. But then she got pregnant and saw my mother's excitement, and it triggered all those old feelings. And instead of talking to me about it, she'd built this whole strategy to make sure my family knew they had no power over our baby. She said she understood now that she'd gone too far in the other direction, that she'd become the controlling person she'd hated, and she was sorry for what she'd done to my grandmother and my sister and my parents. It didn't fix our marriage, and we both knew that, but it was the first time she'd taken real responsibility for her actions instead of justifying them. 2 weeks later, both families sat down together in Wilhelmina's office for a mediation session to establish clear boundaries and a visitation schedule now that the custody arrangement was permanent. Jessica's mother showed up looking tense and unhappy, and my parents came in looking cautious but hopeful. Wilhelmina started by explaining that we needed to create rules that worked for everyone and that both sides would need to compromise. Jessica's mother immediately said she should be able to visit whenever she wanted during Jessica's custody weeks because she was the maternal grandmother and had a special bond with the baby. Wilhelmina gently redirected her and said that's exactly the kind of thinking that had caused problems, that both grandparents had equal importance in the baby's life. We spent 2 hours working through a schedule where both sets of grandparents could visit during our respective custody weeks, but everyone needed to call first and respect if we said it wasn't a good time. Jessica's mother struggled the most with accepting limits, arguing that she'd been there from day one and shouldn't be treated the same as my parents who'd been excluded. But Jessica actually backed up the boundaries we were setting, telling her mother she could visit during Jessica's weeks, but needed to call ahead and couldn't just show up anymore. My parents agreed to the same rules without argument, and we created a shared calendar on our phones so everyone knew the schedule, and there wouldn't be confusion about who had the baby when. During my custody weeks, my family settled into a comfortable routine where my parents came over for dinner twice a week, usually Tuesday and Friday evenings. My sister started video calling from across the country every Sunday morning to see the baby and talk to me about how things were going. My grandmother visited every Sunday afternoon, sitting in my living room, holding her great-granddaughter and telling stories about when my father was young. The baby was thriving with regular time with both families, and I could see her starting to recognize different people and respond to familiar faces. She'd smile when my mother picked her up and reached for my father's glasses, and she'd gotten used to my grandmother's soft voice during those Sunday visits. My mother told me one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner that she was grateful we'd fought for this even though it had cost us our marriage, because our daughter would grow up knowing she was loved by everyone, not just one side of her family. 6 months after that terrible day when I'd first taken the baby to meet my parents, I was living in my own apartment about 15 minutes from our old house. Jessica and I had worked out a functional co-parenting relationship that was better than our marriage had been toward the end, probably because we weren't trying to be married anymore and could just focus on raising our daughter. We exchanged the baby every Sunday evening at 6Y, meeting in the parking lot of a park halfway between our places. The handoffs were usually quick and drama-free, just updates about the baby's schedule and any supplies that needed to be restocked. Both families had regular access during our respective weeks, and nobody needed permission from the other parent anymore because the court order had settled that question permanently. Jessica had even apologized to my grandmother directly, calling her one afternoon and telling her she was sorry for the cruel things she'd said when my grandmother was in the hospital. My grandmother had cried cried and forgiven her immediately because that's the kind of person she was. Our daughter would grow up in 2 households instead of 1, spending half her time with me and my family and half with Jessica and hers. It wasn't the life I'd imagined when we'd gotten married and planned to have children together, but she'd know both her families loved her and wanted to be part of her life. Sometimes that's the best outcome you can hope for when adults make mistakes that can't be undone. When the damage to a marriage is too deep to repair, but you can still build something functional for your child. I was sad our marriage hadn't survived, sad that my daughter would grow up going back and forth between 2 homes instead of having both her parents together. But I was proud I'd stood up for my family's right to know their granddaughter. Proud I hadn't backed down when Jessica tried to use our baby as a weapon.